Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If you want to improve your playing, join me and thousands of other pickers getting better every day at pegheadnation.com. Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. My guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is Jacob Jolliff, who has a fantastic new record out called Instrumentals Volume 2, Mandolin Mysteries, and we're going to chat all about this. Jacob, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Appreciate it.
It's really cool to have you here. One of my favourite things to talk about is instrumental string band music. I love this, and we're in a pretty rich time of it at the moment. And the fact that this is called Instrumentals 2 is a pretty strong hint that it's something you've been doing for a while as well. There's something about instrumental string band music that just, like, I don't know if it's having a heyday now particularly, but it seems to be in an incredibly strong place, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, there was like the pioneers that I look up to, like your Grismans and Bela Fleck and Jerry Douglas, that whole crew. They broke a bunch of new ground in the last, 30, 40 years. And now there's just so many kind of disciples of them and young players my age and much younger that are kind of running with it in a lot of different directions. So, yeah, you're right. It is a fertile time for it.
And I think, so really, one of the interesting things about this record, particularly for me, is that it sort of centers around this art heist suite. And I mean, I love a suite of tunes or something that holds together as like a through listen kind of thing. But it comes out of a Freshgrass commission, and the amount of music that is kind of around at the moment that is coming out of that, just seeing sort of this. I know Sierra Hull had her Bluegrass Concerto that she's recording for her new record, like the Sarah Jarosz Blue Heron Suite, Becky Bully's new record, Donovan's new record. There's like so much stuff is coming out of Freshgrass in terms of, and I'm really keen before we get on to kind of talk about the record, just I'd love to understand how those commissions come about and what the sort of brief you get is.
Man, they asked me, Ollie asked me in maybe, I guess a year and a half ago, like December. So I guess that's December 2022. I think that's when he asked me. And, I was, flattered to be asked, certainly in with good company. It's cool they've asked so many mandolin players. I guess I hadn't written anything of that length before, though I've, you could argue it's sort of like three of my instrumentals, kind of tied together, so I could kind of conceive of it that way. But we were commissioned to write it and perform it at the Bentonville, Arkansas Freshgrass. But then our guitar player at the time had a family emergency. This fellow Stash Weislauch, who's an incredible musician and band leader, has put out a bunch of great records, but he had a really severe family emergency and wasn't able to play, so we weren't able to perform it at Freshgrass. So this is it's commissioned by them but not performed there. But now we've they paid me to write it and we recorded it, and we're now performing it at shows too. So it's evolving now, now that we're actually out there playing it. But yeah, it's man, I wish there were 10 other organizations also doing that. It's a great thing.
Yeah, it's incredible, and it's the range of stuff that is coming out as well. It's not just kind of instrumental concerto type pieces. There's all sorts. People have taken it in all sorts of directions, and you sort of talk about it as being these three movements that are sort of three tunes strung together. But there's definitely thematic stuff that runs through those three movements. They are kind of three movements of a piece, aren't they?
Yeah, and you had asked, sorry, about the brief. I mean, that's pretty loose, though, like kind of vaguely based on the classical concerto, and I think they maybe even specified there should be like a cadenza in a movement, and mine does have that. And what's funny is I've Didn't know that much about concertos. Obviously listened to some amount, but I'm not a classical musician. So having since sort of talked to more classical composer friends of mine, there's actually they wouldn't even need to be as tied together as my movements are. With the three sort of movements of my suite, there's quite a bit of shared material beyond just being in the same key. There's quite a bit of shared melodic material between them, and certainly a shared vibe. But I think that's actually more tied together than some are. They don't even have to be that, as I understand it. And then weirdly, I just started performing that, but then I was also a friend of mine who's an amazing modern classical composer who's a professor at Oberlin College. He wrote me a mandolin concerto to play with the Oberlin Orchestra, which I just performed. So, and that was funny because in some ways it almost felt less classical sounding than some of my stuff. It was a 5-movement concerto, and it was not even all in the same key, and I mean it was incredible, but it was interesting. And that one didn't have a cadenza actually, which is kind of funny. But anyway, so I was sort of doing both simultaneously.
But it's funny, isn't it, with any kind of musical genre or structure or kind of form, the more you know it, the more you feel happy to ignore the rules. And the less you feel you know it, the more you feel like you have to hit some of those points just to be on the safe side.
That's true. Yeah, that's definitely true. And it's, it started, we've now played it enough times. I mean, it's still difficult, but it's starting to loosen up a little bit. I feel like the last time we played it, which was like 3 nights ago, was the best we'd played it. And now, then you start thinking, I wish we could record it now, but that's kind of how it always goes.
Yeah. Well, is there space within it for kind of improvisation and a bit of movement, or is it very much composed?
Yeah, there is. The first movement, there's a pretty long mandolin solo, or at least there's like part of it was written in the studio, but then now I improvise there. But then there's a place that was always improvised, like even in the studio, that part was improvised. And the second movement, there's no improvisation in it, I don't think, other than just little sort of flourishes from night to night. But then the third movement, everyone gets to take a pretty substantial solo. And that's kind of, I would say, on average, it's still more through composed material than a lot of my tunes, but it would kind of not be in keeping with the vibe of the band to not have any improv. The concerto I just played, the one at Oberlin, that one was zero improv, and that was 25 minutes of all through composed. So,
wow.
And that's hard. That's harder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so was the suite the first stuff that you wrote for this record?
Good question. It was close to it. Yeah. I mean, I wrote the whole record relatively fast, like mostly within the last year. There was one tune, the Los Angeles County Breakdown, that I wrote right before the pandemic, but we never played it because we weren't, didn't play for a year and a half, really. That's the oldest tune. But then most of the rest of the stuff I wrote, in the last year or a little bit more. Yeah. And the concerto, I think I finished writing it like a year ago, January. So, yeah.
And were these tunes written for the players you have? Because the people you've got on this record are different from the last record, aren't they? It's a different band entirely.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always had different guys. I mean, not really on purpose. It's kind of like, my first record, Instrumentals Volume 1, was the fellow Stash, who I referenced, and then Jeff Picker, who plays with Nickel Creek, and then Alex Hargreaves, who plays with Billy Strings. And Alex and I, grew up together, and all of those guys are, longtime friends. And just kind of one by one, they got bigger gigs or moved away from New York, and that's kind of how it goes. And I've had, lots of other people. I went through phases of having several people on each instrument who knew my music, who I could call on. But it's never been a long list because it's hard music and it takes a lot to get people up to speed. But now it's kind of solidified in the last year and a half or so to a pretty consistent group, which is the group on the record. And it just kind of takes a while to find the people that are available and kind of want to prioritize doing a gig, but also have the chops and or just in a phase of life where it works well. So I feel lucky
Yeah.
to have those guys.
Well, do you want to run us through who you've got on this record while we're on the subject then?
Yeah, for sure. So on bass, he was on my last record too, but it's Miles Soloniker. He's incredible. He's from Fort Collins, but he lives just down the street in Brooklyn. And then on guitar, Ross Martin, who's played on lots of great, records within this genre. Amazing guitar player. And he lives in Queens. And then George Jackson, who's an incredible fiddler who has a bunch of great records under his name. He's from New Zealand, but he lives in Nashville, Tennessee. Yeah, that's the band.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that about like people being able to drop in and out of stuff like this, because it's not quite the same thing as sitting in with a band. Is it? You need to know the material, particularly when stuff is so composed. And it makes me think of, I remember when Punch Brothers first started getting together, and Critter was still sort of slightly tied to the String Dusters for a year, and Brian Sutton sat in with him for a while and had to learn The Blind Leading the Blind. And it's that's a hell of a depth gig, isn't it?
Totally. I mean, their music is obviously crazy challenging, and it's just not really material that's designed to have sub musicians, both because there's not many people that could pull it off, and also it just takes so much time to get it tight. So it's not really music that's designed to have a lot of subs, but the fact is you kind of just have to be, everyone that has ever played in my group is, a really great musician that has other opportunities, and you have to be a really big gig in terms of what you can pay and offer to sort of demand people's like availability at all points. And definitely my gig is not at that level, where I've got people on retainer, and actually very few bluegrass gigs are. I can only think of two. But and that's really interesting, because I think like so many people that I've interviewed have more than one project on the go. Like even members of Punch Brothers, Chris Thiele's concept and other stuff, they're all in other bands as well. And everybody's, unless you are playing with Billy or Molly, essentially, and even playing with Molly, you've got Bronwyn's doing her own stuff. Dominic's got a hotel when he can. They've all got other things going on. Right. Totally.
One of the things I love about the bluegrass world and the string band world in general is just like reading the liner notes, looking at the record, and seeing who crops up where, and all those little connections. It's like you were talking about the Grissman records and the Bela records, and and then the records with Edgar and Mike Marshall spans some of those things, and Jerry spans some of those things, and Tony Rice spans some of those things, and I love all that. Yeah,
me too. Yeah, and all those guys were all on each other's records, and various projects where one's the band leader and the other are like technically sidemen, and then you see that obviously like in the jazz world too. But sometimes it doesn't really even matter who is the band leader. It's like it's kind of different assortments of the same cats. But and another one I'm thinking of too is my buddy Grant Gordy, who he's putting out a lot of amazing music, and that's sort of a yet another sort of take on the acoustic music, sort of proggy acoustic music idiom, and I love what he does. And he also is another New York guy. So
and that sort of talking about the Art Heist suite, just the title of that, like the album's called Mandolin Mysteries, and there's this sort of thread of like it's not like the whole tone of the record is like that, but there's enough of it that it definitely feels like that's an apt title for the record. I mean, it kicks off particularly with Vera, which is such a slinky kind of tune. I love it. It's a great tune.
Thank you. Yeah, are you a fan of the show? Or?
So I'd read it was named after the kind of British detective show. Yeah. Which is pretty kind of slow moving stuff, right?
Very slow moving. Yeah. I mean, I love it. I was just home in Oregon, and I watched a couple episodes with my parents. It's a real watch with your parents type of show. It just barely moves along. But and that was probably it's that instrumental probably a little of departure too than from some of my other stuff, which is usually pretty high energy in a certain sense, and that's a little more reserved. But yeah, I don't know. The tune's just kind of. I was joking about calling it Mandolin Mysteries because it's sort of a corny title, and then I was just like, you know what, let's do it. Let's just call it that. And I'm a big, I like detective books. I like, there's a couple tunes that are named after Sherlock Holmes stories, which I'm a big Sherlock Holmes fan too. And then the Art Ice Suite just sort of has a sort of 007 vibe to it. And even I kind of got inspiration from a couple movements from listening to a bunch of the James Bond like themes from over the years, like the initial song that plays in the movie. But yeah, so it kind of just I don't know why the selection of material kind of coalesced around that kind of a funny theme for a mandolin record, but it did. So
well, it's a funny one, isn't it? Because like songs are songs, and the lyrics carry so much weight whether you intend them to or not. But with instrumentals, how you name them and then how you sort of bring them together with some sort of theme, it's a slightly more nebulous thing, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
you can end up with that thing of just any time somebody says something slightly funny or slightly odd, you stick it in a list and go, oh, that'll be a tune one day.
Yeah, I definitely have that list, Yeah, and actually, funnily enough, I originally told my graphic artist to I want kind of like a James Bond type of theme for the cover. And after receiving his first draft, and I love this graphic artist, he's done all my records, but after receiving the first draft, I realized that all the imagery that you would use to convey a James Bond theme, which is mostly scantily clad ladies and guns, it turns out that's not what I want to really put on the cover of my mandolin record, so we kind of had to throw out the first draft. I mean, he nailed it. It was very James Bond. We're like, you know what, I don't think I can pull this off and don't particularly want to pull it off, so we'll go slightly different direction, but that's what I discovered.
Yeah, well, I love the artwork. It's really cool. But yeah, I can totally see where you're coming from with that.
It's a little James Bond imagery is pretty dependent on a few things, and they shouldn't be on the cover of a mandolin record, I don't think.
No, so. And I kind of with that whole world of James Bond, that kind of steered it in a bit of a shinier direction these days. But it's not something you would make today if you were starting from this point, is it?
No. Yeah, and there's actually, other than liking the vibe and in general liking the music and soundtracking stuff, I'm not a particularly big fan, but for whatever reason, especially the Art Heist Suite, it just sort of has a lot of those minor sort of motives and harmonic movements that just are very spy sounding without for lack of a better way of saying it.
No, it's funny, isn't it? As soon as you say that, I think everybody can probably picture in their ear a kind of sound, and there's a certain tonal kind of hook that all the Bond themes have. Just,
absolutely,
they're very different songs, but there's something that runs through them all that's got a little distinctive sound signature almost.
For sure. Yeah. And there's also I'll say too, especially coming out of Grisman, there's this sort of a lineage of minory mandolin instrumentals. Well, actually, it goes back to Bill Monroe at least. Maybe you could even argue it goes back to classical mandolin, the sort of that kind of Lady and the Tramp tremolo-y minory type of vibe. But certainly Grisman has a lot of very minor tunes. In fact, I think the first Grisman record I think there's one song that's not in a minor key, but for the most part they are all in minor keys. And so I kind of feel like it's sort of in that lineage, but I feel like it has a slightly different twinge to it on my record. Some of the sort of extensions on the minor chords, I think it make it maybe not as Grisman-y, and maybe just a little more bebop influenced or something. But
well, it's funny you say that because it's definitely true about Grisman, and yet Los Angeles County Breakdown, which is very kind of major breezy, Brian Breezy, major sevenths kind of. There's a bit that maybe later Grisman has that more sort of West Coast sort of sound, and it definitely reminds me a bit of that.
Oh, cool. Yeah. No, that could, thinking some of the happier Grisman instrumentals Dog's Bowl, that's kind of that vibe. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And it's that just even in the title, Los Angeles County Breakdown, just it got that little nod of tip of the hat to the sort of the West Coast almost.
Yeah, and it being one in a long line of county breakdowns, in bluegrass, Brown County Breakdown, and all those,
Yeah, and one of the things that I read about this record that I find really interesting is that you composed a lot of the tunes on piano rather than on the mandolin.
Yeah, Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I have a piano. I was just messing around on it before you called. It's not a very good piano, but it's still better than I am at piano, which is, not very good. But, I think just for coming up with melodies, it's almost sometimes easier when you have less facility on an instrument, because, when you've played an instrument for a long time, you can kind of take maybe a melodic fragment that isn't that compelling and sort of dress it up with your chops to be
Mm.
like, oh, I guess this is a tune. But when you don't have particular, if you don't really have facility on an instrument, then it's kind of like more like, is this a melody that I like? Is this worth teaching to the other three guys? Um, and so I like that aspect of writing on an instrument that I'm not good at. And then also on piano, even if you're not good at it, which I'm not, you have the ability to, throw chords beneath whatever melody line you're playing in the right hand. And I find that sometimes you kind of intuit interesting harmonic things because it's sort of easy to move around chords on the piano and voice lead, even if you don't know what you're doing really. And then, I can learn that again on the mandolin or figure out what it was. But, a lot of it, it's just using an instrument you don't play very well, so you don't make the same decisions you always make. Yeah. And that
Yeah,
combined with, yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
and that's interesting because it's often with writing or improvising, people sort of kind of suggest you should sing things first and then try and find them on your instrument, just to so rather than just relying on the things your fingers know how to do, find the sounds first. And it's because maybe this is like my experience is largely playing fretted stringed instruments, and they tend to be much more visual in terms of like visual patterns mapped out on a fretboard. Whereas if you play like a clarinet or the piano or a trumpet or whatever, you maybe don't, they're not as visual instrument. The piano is obviously very visual, but all the notes are just there in one place laid out, you know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would argue piano it's almost the most visual, but it's different visual than the
Mm,
mandolin. Like, in fact, it's like, I don't know, I feel like the piano is almost the most intuitive in terms of, up is this way, down is this way,
yeah.
um, not to mention like an arpeggio on a piano and a chord on the piano, they can be like one and the same because you have that ability to play like a root position arpeggio versus mandolin. We can't actually play like root position chords. I'm sorry. Yeah, chords. We can play like for instance, like a G arpeggio on the mandolin. It's not going to look exactly the same as a G chord because the nature of the intervals, we can't actually voice it that way.
Mm,
Um, so yeah, I think the piano is. I think the visual aspect helps me, but it's like visual combined with no ability. So it's sort of like I'm really having to see it. Also, you were saying, like be able to sing it first, and that makes total sense. I think kind of what I do when I'm writing on the piano, it's like I don't necessarily sing it first, but I sort of mess around until I hear something that I like glom onto. So you know, composing, for me, it's like improvising, but in slow motion, kind of,
mm.
where you're kind of following your ears. Um, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I have a similar experience improvising in a way, in that sometimes when you sit and your ears drawn to certain stuff, you have to slow down and work out where that is. If you're like, you have the
yeah,
level of facility I have, it's that thing of going, oh, I can hear a pattern that comes after that, but I can't
yeah,
immediately play it in real time. And that's often where the most
totally.
interesting stuff comes, because if you do, like, I
Yeah,
just end up then otherwise just playing things I already know.
right, exactly. Yeah, no, that's a lot of practicing for me too. Is if all you ever did was sit down and play, then you would always just play the same thing, and you would only be playing the stuff you're already capable of. But so to me, that's actually not even practicing. Like that's playing, which is different. Like practicing, it involves like getting under the hood a little bit more, where it's like, oh, like maybe you start by improvising over this tune, and then you quickly arrive upon something that you can't quite do,
Mm.
or a harmonic idea that you can't quite follow through in real time. So then you're forced to slow it down and figure it out. Then maybe you take that idea and you expand it. You're like, okay, this is a sequence that I like. It worked there. Let's practice doing it everywhere on this tune. Let's practice doing it on these other tunes and putting it through different keys. And that's that grunt work that then, if you do enough of it, ups your ability to do it in real time when you're on the gig or in a jam or something. Yeah.
And so to take that like from you sitting writing melodies and maybe some sort of skeleton harmony with the left hand at the piano, to take that to the point where the band are playing that, there's like particularly some of the more complex stuff in the suite. What's the process? Are you writing things down? Are you recording parts? How do you get those from you to the band? We'll be right back with you just after this. Collings Guitars has been a long-time supporter of the bluegrass community, from collaborating with artists to sponsoring festivals big and small, and now by sponsoring Bluegrass Jam Along. Handmade in Austin, Texas, every Collings guitar and mandolin that leaves the shop is built from the sound up, and the team loves seeing a Collings in the hands of players of all levels, from local musicians to world-renowned pickers. Visit collingsguitars.com for more. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. With 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music, Peghead Nation has something for every picker. You'll learn the tunes and techniques you need to join in at jams and play the music you love, plus advanced techniques like improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 per month, and you can add more for $10 a month. Sign up for any course and get your first month free with the promo code JAMALONG, all one word. Join thousands of other players, including me, who are advancing on their instruments and having more fun playing the roots music they love at pegheadnation.com.
Well, it's definitely a little more haphazard than people that write it all in Sibelius or Finale, which is obviously a great approach. Mine is definitely a little bit more like voice memo here, or for instance with the Art High Suite, what I actually did is I just recorded it all into Logic. I recorded all the parts either on the mandolin or on the piano, and then sent the guys the stems so they could listen to what their part was, and their part might be partially played on mandolin, partially played on piano, and so then there's maybe with chordal stuff a bit of they'll have to manipulate that a little bit to make it work on their instrument, but the lines they could just learn from that. And then they get to hear this very funny sounding version of the suite that's just mandolin and piano and not everything in the right octaves. But I will say that then, these guys, are all really good at learning things by ear. And I'm also quicker at learning by ear. Not only can I learn it quicker by ear, but I'll have it memorized and ingrained deeper if I learn it by ear versus from music. And that's, a big reason I do it, but also it's the laziness of not wanting to write it all out. And not being particularly proficient at writing it out. But then also, I know for me too, I think this is maybe just a further excuse for why I don't do it. But I sometimes think if you get something looking really nice on the page, you're maybe not as prone to editing it. So I kind of like the fact that through the haphazardness of it, and as I teach it or they learn it from voice memo, it's maybe doesn't give quite as set in stone of a vibe. And so it's almost more inviting to a certain amount of editing along the way. It's it actually reminds me of my dad, who's retired now, but he was an English professor, and he talked about how the level of writing, in college, went down a lot when kids started drafting on the computer, because if you draft on the computer, it looks really nice even if the writing is terrible. But if you draft longhand and then have to type it into the computer, it no matter what, it undergoes a certain level of editing through inputting into the computer. And so I sort of think about it that way a little bit. It could all just be laziness, but the fact that it's a little haphazard as I teach this stuff. I'm also I'm not quite as hell bent on it on certain things, and it's a little open for interpretation.
That's really funny, because I had some creative writing lessons at one point, and the teacher said the thing to do when you're writing your first draft is choose the ugliest font you can find, because it doesn't look like finished work. And it's as soon as you've got it all laid out beautifully on a page in Times New Roman, it looks like a novel. But if you put a hideous Comic Sans kind of font, you can't take it too seriously, and so you keep editing and you don't get carried. It's exactly the same thing. You don't get carried away with the idea this is a finished thing. It's just your first thoughts, Yeah,
it's actually, I think it's probably kind of an extension of what I was saying about writing on instruments that you don't have any facility on. If I I could write something that's really not melodically compelling or harmonically compelling on the mandolin, and because I can sort of execute it and maybe dress it up, make it real chopsy and impressive, it might sound like a thing, and I'd be like, no, that's the tune, that sounds great, that's burning. But when it's me barely being able to eke it out in the piano, it's really there's gotta be a granule of something that I really like melodically to want to keep it, because I'm not doing it any favors through my execution,
Yeah. No, totally. That makes sense. And so the range of material across the record, obviously the Art Heist suite is pretty composed, but you were saying there's room in there for improv. And is the rest of it largely, I don't want to say fiddle tunes, but by fiddle tunes, I mean like a tune in the sense that you might find on a Bela record, or where it's a tune with sections that you play and then improvise around, rather than being,
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely, I think, very much in the vein of the Bela Grisman stuff. I tend to reference those guys a lot, but obviously there's a lot of others. I think, there's very few tunes where we pass around the same solo section. For instance, Vera, everyone gets a little piece of it, but it's a little different. I take a pretty long solo over two forms. I guess Ross, he solos over the same form. George doesn't take a solo, but he sort of leads the charge on the sort of more Celtic, Irish sounding part. So, and then there's a lot of tunes where nobody solos over the exact same section, like the Devil Hath Power to Assume a Pleasing Shape. Like that tune, it's not so much like we each get a form. It's like we each get to solo over a piece of the form. And I have a lot of tunes like that. I don't know why exactly. So there's it's a lot of stuff that, like you say, it is kind of coming out of the fiddle tune idiom, but there's not really any straight fiddle tunes on there.
Yeah, but they feel recognizable to somebody who's heard fiddle tunes and heard people play like that. And I think sometimes when you just have a tune and everybody plays a tune and everybody takes a break over all the sections of the tune, it can stuff can get a bit structurally blocky and your ear tends to switch off sometimes. And there's something really nice about actually mixing it up as to who takes a break where and which sections come where, and maybe playing around with the forms a bit as well. So it's not just each section is repeated in the same order each time.
Absolutely. I think I kind of like when stuff sounds easier than it is, kind of as opposed to the opposite. Well, I guess maybe I like the opposite sometimes, but some of the tunes, it might, if you were to the casual listener, or if you're just not paying that close of attention, might seem like, oh, they're just passing it around. But then if you tried to learn the arrangement, you might realize, oh, it's actually a little different each time. And I maybe the intention is to sort of fight against that tendency of the listener to tune out if it becomes too blocky. So you're mixing it up a little bit. I think a lot of, I would say a lot of for me, playing instrumental music, live we sing too, but there's a lot, it's half instrumental music. And the fight is trying to keep the audience from tuning out, because you can, even if you shred a couple tunes and, some fast tune with burning solos, if you do that too much, people just become numb to it. That just becomes the new normal. And you can maybe do one or two tunes in a row and they're like, wow, that was crazy. But then by the third, they're like, that's just the tempo we're moving at now. You don't realize you're going fast an hour into an airplane flight, and so I think a lot of the goal for me, and I think I tried to be even more intentional about that on this record, is to really have peaks and valleys, style wise, and with people dropping out here and there. There's a lot of times when it'll drop, one or two or three people will drop out, and it's all about just trying to, not that you're always just stay interested to the audience, but it's you're wanting it to be interesting to people other than just the mandolin players that are maybe mandolin nerds, or obviously I want them to hopefully like it too, but you want it to seem interesting to the layman too.
Yeah, and it gives the record texture, because sometimes you can just get 4 or 5 people playing at the same time and it's just a different person is taking the lead. But with something like this, you get that sense that you are passing things around a bit more like a string quartet does, where you can hear bits of melody move between instruments and hear things. And it's a bit more texturally intricate than just, here's the band, this is who's taking a break at the moment. It's much more kind of involved in that.
Right. Yeah, that's the goal for sure. Yeah.
And so it's interesting talking about that because I had a similar experience going to see the Bela My Bluegrass Heart tour here early in the year. And I was a little bit
Nice.
apprehensive before I went because that is a long record full of pretty high intensity music. And like knowing the people who were playing, I shouldn't have worried about it. But like that, and they go out of their way to make the show kind of fun and dynamic and constantly changing, and like because it could just be pretty intense if they stood in a row and played you music that intricate for an hour and a half, like it is.
Yeah.
And they really go out of their way to make it far more entertaining than that. And you played some of those shows, didn't you, with one of the iterations of the band?
Yeah, in 2022, I did like 20 or 30 shows with them, which was amazing, and that's certainly, I mean, Bela was already a huge influence on me, but getting to witness firsthand his band leading, is something I've really cherished and thought a lot about how, he's really great at that and try to think about all the things he does right, and certainly, yeah, no one's better than him at presenting a whole show of really heady music and still making it accessible, and not in like a sellout or gimmicky way, but just in just a lot of intention, really thinking about different textures and it's it's amazing. I mean, those shows there's something, certainly plenty for the avid music connoisseur and like advanced musician, but then I think there's plenty for someone who doesn't really know anything about bluegrass. And yeah, he's so great at that. Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing, isn't it? If you are leading a band and writing the material, but I don't know, you guys have vocals at the gigs and stuff, but if you are a musician in the string band tradition who doesn't sing, and there are a few of them out there, and you lead a band, and it's a very interesting approach, isn't it? Because there's just so much about singing that we just makes it simple for people to latch onto music. It sort of tells you where you are, whether it's a verse or a chorus, like what the song is quote unquote about, all those things that with instrumental music you have to think a little bit more about, maybe.
True. Yeah. And that's, I know, that's why largely, I like to sing and I love traditional bluegrass music. So I like to play it, but also I don't really want to play a show of purely, instrumental music, even though, even the vocal tunes, there's lots of picking on them. We do, lots of, in fact, I feel like that probably gets even more attention than the singing, but, it's just, it's easier to keep people engaged. And I really love playing bluegrass. Obviously, even, I don't know what he was doing when he was over in the UK, but when I did the Bela shows, there were several vocal tunes every night. Not as many as we do, but there's a few. And it's just, that's part of the bluegrass tradition too. It's like, sort of assumed that you can sing when you're in a bluegrass band. And not everyone's like a, Del McCurry or Tony Rice or something. But, when you play pickup bluegrass gigs, the assumption is that it kind of goes around the circle and everyone sings a tune every fourth tune, or, sometimes maybe one person sings a bit more. But it's one of the things I like about bluegrass is that everyone sings. And also I think certainly for like playing, taking breaks, taking solos over the vocal tunes, you kind of have to be able to sing them a little bit, because it's kind of everything's based off the melody. So you can, I think I grew a lot as a musician when I started singing more. So yeah, I like.
I'm really interested with those Bela shows. I heard you on, I think he was on Daniel Patrick's Mandolins and Beer podcast talking about those shows. And if I've remembered it right, you said you hadn't met Bela before that, but he's a massive influence. And in the same conversation, you said something along the lines of, you learn a lot more from sitting and playing with a musician face to face than you learn from listening to their records. And I wondered what you'd learned from spending that time with Bela, and just hanging around somebody like that, and, what inspiration or what ideas or what thoughts you'd had coming out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to say actually. I don't think there's any limit to how much you can absorb from a master like that from recordings. I think you can continue to go back and transcribe and learn more. But I think you learn least I learned different stuff by being around them in person. You know, you learn a lot just hanging out, driving in the SUV, hearing their takes on different records and musicians, and you learn a lot. At least I did, just watching Bela lead a rehearsal. You know, like I think in my memory, there's sort of like less talk, more playing, which I really like. And when he offered critiques or compliments, they're very sort of no BS, very like in the best way. In the best way, just like if he offers a compliment, it seems very, you know, like he's not just you know, blowing smoke up you, like he actually really liked that thing. And then if there's a critique, it's not like a personal attack. It's very like just he wants this thing a particular way, and it's just like a really good way to lead a rehearsal. You know, sort of not wasting any time, and then also I think it. I feel like the band leader is sort of a trickle down thing too, like the way the band leader is comporting himself musically and personally, and really affects the band. And he's a really great dude, and also just like plays his butt off at every show. I mean, that was an amazing thing to watch. I think too, is just how consistent he improvises amazing solos every night, and kind of just never takes a bad solo. Like I'm sure he thinks he does, but there always is like an amazing arc to them, and you feel like you went somewhere, and that that was amazing, you know. So yeah, I just try to think about it when I'm leading a band, which is a lot now.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because I said hello to Bryan Sutton after the London show, and he was saying they kind of left Ireland, they've been traveling all night, they were all exhausted, and I was watching it from the audience thinking, like, particularly Bela, thinking like, if that's what he plays like when he's tired, and that level of focus, and like it's exactly what you say, and with all of those musicians, but the ability to take you on a little journey with each break. It's not just, it's picking up the energy where somebody else handed it to you, and it's doing something with it and handing it off to somebody else, so the whole thing stays alive, isn't it? And it's right. You know, and it's incredible to watch. And presumably you and Cody Kilby sort of dropped into that show at a point where the other people in the band had done a bunch of shows already. So you would have required a bit of rehearsal, because I guess it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you're just dropped into it and off you go, you know?
Yeah. My first tour that I did with them, which was like 2 years ago this month, I guess, it was with Cody, and we were both newbies, and we did like 3 days of rehearsing with Bela just as a trio in his backyard, which was, I mean, that's some of my fondest memories from the experience, was that we did 3 days, just me and Cody and Bela, and then 2 more days with the whole band. So that was awesome. You know, we were playing the whole arrangements, but just the 3 of us. So we would even comp through the various breaks, play it as the record, but just 3/5. And that was really cool. And then I did, that was the only run that I did with Cody, but then a bunch with Sutton. There was 3, I think when I did it, Michael did most of the shows, but Billy Contreras did a few, and Stuart Duncan did a few. And they were both amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
That's really cool. Like talking of banjo, I was going to ask, because on this record and the previous on Instrumentals Volume 1, there's the kind of traditional 5-piece string band, but there's no banjo. And is that kind of, it's obviously a conscious choice. You didn't book somebody and they didn't turn up, but I'm just curious to kind of understand, like, why that choice?
Well, I love the banjo. I think probably when I started my group, you know, a few years back, if I had sort of, you know, endless budget or just more budget, I probably would have a 5-piece with banjo. But since I didn't, and the perfect fiddle player was there, meaning my buddy Alex, and I wouldn't say the perfect banjo player was really, you know, right around me, fiddle made sense. I also like that it's a sustaining instrument, you know, so that's a good compliment. Good compliment to the mandolin, though it's the same pitch range as the mandolin, so you could kind of argue that banjo would also have worked as well. But, and then, you know, a lot of the repertoire was written for that quartet, and it continues to be, and now it's sort of the sound that we have, you know, is that 4-piece. I mean, I would never say I wouldn't ever add a banjo because I love banjo, but it's funny how it worked out. I've also I will say I've played with a lot of great banjo players. Um, in fact, like most of my favorite gigs I've had, I've been, getting to do the stuff with Bela and getting to do stuff with Tony Trischka, and
Hmm.
grew up playing with my dad, who's a great banjo player. So I've kind of and then did a tenure with this band Joy Kills Sorrow with Wes Corbett on banjo, who's incredible. He
Yeah.
plays for Sam Bush, and we go back, a long ways too. But so I've certainly got to play across from a lot of amazing banjo players. So I would like to do a record with banjo at some point. But a lot of it is kind of just the financial thing of like it's adding a fifth person as another person to pay and get a hotel room for, but and then and it's another schedule to have to work around. And then on the records, I've always used the approach with my records. Some people kind of go and hire like a record band, which is a cool vibe. It's a different vibe. I've always taken the approach of like, I'm going to do my best to use the band I'm going to have on the road. Hasn't always worked out because then the guys aren't always available. But currently, the group on the record we'll be doing like 50 more shows together this year with those same cats. And so that's my intention has always been like, oh no, I want the record to be my band, not necessarily like a bunch of studio cats that I don't have a history with. I also might try to make a record that way sometime. Get a crew of great players in Nashville and see what that would be like. But yeah, thus far it's kind of been like I use my band for the record, and it's kind of also like I feel like my music is sort of coming out of a certain lineage of like New York, like zany New York bluegrass, like Trischka and Grisman, and Andy Statman, so there's a lot of great sort of weirder bluegrass to come out of New York, and so I like recording here and using cats that for the most part live in New York. So yeah.
Yeah. So you're going to be able to tour quite a bit. Then you've got quite a busy summer coming up.
Yeah. We just got back from a weekend in Colorado, and I think we have maybe about 50 more gigs this year. Yeah, so it's pretty busy through like October.
Cool.
So, yeah, I'm excited. Yeah, it's fun. We like a few shows ago we played all this music from the new album live for the first time, and that's wild to just play all this new stuff for the first time at the same show. I mean, Vera was the only tune we'd performed already, and it's a lot. It's pretty relentless when you're playing it all. But it's a lot of fun, and I like the way it's going over live. So.
And have you kept much stuff from the like previous records in the show, or are you basically doing new stuff?
So vocally, there's a bunch of stuff we've either recorded or been doing for a while. Instrumentally, since we started doing the new tunes, we haven't been doing any of the older tunes except for one, which I have just brought out at random with zero rehearsal to just see. Sometimes it's kind of fun, like how will this go if the last time we played it was on stage like 8 months ago. But for the most part, just the new tunes, though I think I'll probably start to intersperse some of the old ones at some point during the summer. But it's playing new stuff is always fun. And then at a certain point, the old stuff will start to be fun because you haven't played it for a while.
Yeah.
So it's kind of nice.
And then there'll be like Instrumentals Volume 3 to contend with, and they'll have to fit in the set somewhere.
I know. I mean, I don't know if I probably will I'll hopefully make a bunch more records, but I don't know if I'm going to make an Instrumentals Volume 3. We'll see, I have a lot of other ideas too,
See what comes out of the piano next.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well,
totally.
It's such a cool record. I've really been enjoying it. I hope it does really well for you. And yeah, enjoy the gigs. I'd love to get a chance to see that at a show at some point.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Do you come over to the what town are you in, by the way?
I'm in London over here. I came over to IBMA last year. I'm going to try and make it out again this year. That's sort of my annual thing.
Yeah, we'll be there one day at IBMA. We're playing a couple sets.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, well, maybe we'll get to see it.
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, definitely look me up if you make it over.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining me. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.